Hi, Professor Olson, coming to you almost live again. I thought we would go over Chapter 9 today, the recovery and growth of European society in the High Middle Ages. The Middle Ages are broken into 2 or 3 parts, depending on which historian you look at or follow. There's the early Middle Ages, the Middle Ages, and then there are the High or the late Middle Ages. When we talk about the High Middle Ages, we're looking at really the culmination of culture, flowering of culture, a lot of societal changes, and of course, some of this even pertains to our own lives today. Other things have fallen by the wayside. But regardless, the High Middle Ages are really where Europe especially begins to find itself coming out of an economic slump, a cultural slump, and becoming more, I don't want to say civilized because that word is sometimes considered almost prejudicial, but it's where Europe really begins to, shall we say, flower and set up for what we will see as the Renaissance, or as the Italians would say, the Renaissance, the rebirth of classical culture. And of course, that being co-opted and preempted and then turned into a more cultural tool going forward for those who participate in the Renaissance. So why don't we get started? We'll take a look at all of this, see how this pertains to us today, and also how it does not, because obviously culture changes, society changes, many things change in the course of even just a few decades. Look at fashion, for example. So when we look at this High Middle Ages period, remember when we spoke last time in Chapter 8, we said that the Earth had been going through a cooling period and how a lot of fields could not be used. Well, now the climate improves, it warms up, so more marginalized land was able to now be farmed. Things that would have really not yielded anything are finally able to be used. Also, the tools are getting a bit better, so they're able to clear more forests, they're able to drain more swamps, they're able to start reclaiming the land. All right, in fact, probably one of the most dramatic parts of Europe where this is going on is the Netherlands. They literally reclaim land from the ocean, from the sea, and were able then to build upon it and to use it for fields. All right. So we have a lot of our modern day toolbox coming into play: saws, hammers, nails, axes. All right. And also scythes. Now, if you've ever seen Death, he carries a scythe, that strange curved blade on a pole. That was used to clear growth, usually hay. And of course, because it was used during the harvest, it was seen Death was harvesting humans at the end of their lives or when they were badly injured. And of course, remember, we spoke about how the life expectancy in the last chapter had actually gone down. All right. Now, all of these changes are producing a bit of a population boom. So we have better climate, which means we can grow more food. We're able to reclaim more land via irrigation and draining of swamps and clearing the trees. So we now have better food, better climate, and people begin to live longer. All right, they also came up with a new plow. They were able to now plow better. Horses are not utilized to their fullest potential right away because it was hard to come up with a harness for them that wouldn't choke them with the windpipe. But now the new horse collars are able to allow horses rather than oxen to plow the fields. And with more weight to those plows, they're able to sink in deeper. You might remember we mentioned how there was clay and it was sticking. So now they're able to draw those plows farther, and they're heavier and they're actually sharper because now they're using iron to tip the plows. All right, the karuka, not a dance, it's a plow. The karuka will actually be able to help with this along with the horse collars. All right. And so now we also have more technology. People are beginning to figure out how to use water and wind to create wheels and mills, which are able then to automate production. They're not on the scale of our modern day factories, but they're still starting to be able to use things so that people don't have to expend so much effort. All right. And then the other thing which helps with more food, which creates more population, is they go from a 2 to a 3 field system. You might remember in chapter 8, I mentioned how certain crops can leach or take the nutrients from the soil, like wheat, whereas beans give it back. So now they're able to have not one field lying fallow or unused while it regenerates, and then using the other one for wheat or whatever the crop will be, probably wheat, because bread is one of the big staples for the European diet at this point. But now they break it up and they have a 3-field system. So one field can lie fallow, one field can be used for wheat, and one can be used for some crop that will hopefully put nutrients back into the soil. And then they just keep rotating these fields. So sometimes I feel like I'm teaching agriculture 101, but part of what we need to understand is how harvesting and how crops and how farming work, because remember, so many people in Europe at this point and throughout most of human history tend to be on the farm. Production of food is critical for human survival. Nowadays, we walk into a grocery store, we don't exactly know where things come from. We're kind of out of touch with that. So these are some of the things I want you to think about for this chapter. Think about, how much things have improved on a farming scale, which of course creates better food, larger population. All right. Unfortunately, of course, a lot of forests were destroyed in this process because the trees were not as important to the people of Europe as food production. All right, so a lot of our forests, such as the Teutoburg forest, will be chopped down somewhat. I mean, the Teutoburg forest is still there, but it's smaller than it was in the beginning. All right, so these are just some of the things I want you to think about. All right, now everything is seasonal. All right, we're kind of out of touch with some of these things. All right, because obviously we have electric lights now, so we're not bound by the sun rising and going down. We can work or do whatever, regardless of whether it's night or day. We're also kind of removed from the seasonal clock. All right, and when I say the seasonal clock, our holidays still somewhat reflect this. So what you would do is, if you were living in Europe and you were a farmer, and percentage-wise most people were, you would be planning for the big event, which of course is the harvest. All right, but in order to get there in the spring, you begin, as soon as you know the frosts are not going to destroy your crop, you start seeding the ground. You start putting in your seeds. You are breeding your livestock, and now you're waiting for that crop of lambs and foals from your cows and your horses to come to fruition. You're waiting for the birthing to happen so you will be able to replenish your livestock. So during the spring, it's a lot of new beginnings. And in a way, Easter in the North American calendar kind of celebrates this. All right, this beginning of new life, new growth. And then, of course, throughout the summer, you're tending to everything. It's maturing. It's, vital to keep out the weeds. And then, of course, in the fall, nowadays, the North American calendar, we have Halloween. All right, would be the harvest time. You would have everybody, and I mean everybody, coming back to deal with the harvest. All right, in fact, during Europe's Middle Ages and early modern period, a lot of men fought according to the seasonal calendar. Even the lords and all would go away. They would fight their seasonal warfare, but everybody would go home for the harvest. And of course, in winter, everybody just locked themselves away and waited for winter to end and enjoyed the surplus that they had brought in. People were drying things, preserving things. So everything was very seasonal for the Europeans, all right? And in fact, a lot of the Catholic Church's holidays, saints' days, even today, were celebrated in Europe to give people a break. It's a lot of work, all right? So your peasant families lived very simply. There was men and women, usually in an economic partnership, all right? And of course, if you're a serf, your lord really wants you to have families in order to keep perpetuating the serfdom, to perpetuate taking care of the fields. All right. Your aristocrats, meanwhile, a lot of them are away fighting in wars and being involved in politics. So your ladies of the manor, assisted by stewards, are responsible for a lot of household management because with their husbands away, somebody had to look out for everyone and make sure that everything was running smoothly. All right. And of course, because towns and cities begin to spring up little by little, a lot of food is necessary to be siphoned off and go to them. And of course, they are earning, the farmers, especially the freer farmers who don't answer to lords, who aren't serfs, are able to bring in a bit more of a profit. Remember, they used to be subsistence farming, just basically making enough to survive. Now they have a profit and they're able to actually gain some, economic realm. But one thing that never ever happens is none of these peasants, for the most part, were able to fully leave their lords and become independent. So even as the High Middle Ages are kicking off and we're seeing a culture emerge thanks to people like Chaucer and Dante, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, Dante's Inferno and Purgatory and, Purgatorio and Paradiso, even though we're seeing a literary and artistic culture emerging, for the most part, people are still living the same lives they lived in the early Middle Ages, except now they're having more access to better better food, better economic situation, and in some cases, a little more access to education, depending on where you were living. All right. But overall, not a whole lot's changed societally. Lords are still in charge. Vassals still have to fulfill military obligations. And of course, many of your lords abused their power over their subjects. And women were in the background, but if you were upper class, you were managing the household. You might be able to do some basic reading, writing, and figuring in order to balance the budget and make sure everything was working. All right. So some women even fulfilled diplomatic roles, again, among the upper class. All right, we need to remember a lot of women were basically taking care of children and taking care of their basic household needs. And that's a lot of work in and of itself, but women's history overall hasn't changed a whole lot. Their roles have not changed a whole lot. In the upper class, however, they are beginning to change. All right. And some women became idealized in medieval literature. In addition to Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales and Dante and Inferno, and of course now we have the emergence of King Arthur and Guinevere and Romance of the Rose, or Romance de la Rose. But we don't have a large body of work, because remember, this is before the printing press, so people were still communicating orally. Chaucer actually gave performances of the Canterbury Tales as he was writing it. He would, according to the sources we have, would act out the parts of the knight and the squire and the wife of Bath. Now that would have been entertaining to watch, right? So all of this, however, women are beginning to have not necessarily more rights, but they're beginning to be seen in a different light, at least among the upper class, and they become incredibly idealized in a way that kind of loses their humanity. They're put on a pedestal, and we're going to talk about chivalry and how that it goes hand in hand with this and the idea of courtly love. All right. And again, in addition to having better food and having a better economic situation, now trade, which has been basically non-existent since the fall of Rome in 476, begins to come back. In the East, if you remember, we talked about the split of the Roman Empire, the East still had access to luxury goods, and the East was doing pretty well, but now the West is beginning to catch up. They're no longer just bartering for those luxury goods, but they're beginning to create their own goods. Lords began to grant charters to people who were craftsmen. Those craftsmen formed cities and towns that were actually independent of the Lord's control. They were eventually given their independence. And with the craftsmen gathering in one place, more and more trade began to occur. All right, so this was very, very important. And of course, guilds are going to come into existence. They're kind of like unions in today's day and age, all right? They're going to direct all the different concerns that craftsmen are going to have. Even today, we have trade fairs. There's Toy Fair in New York, for example, all right? And those trade fairs actually spring out of the High Middle Ages period, all right? And in fact, Burgundy, a small little kingdom, was quite wealthy. And actually, that is where trade fairs began to emerge. So people would come and they would trade between the Italy and the Flemish merchants, those in Flanders. Even today, Flanders is known for having a textile industry. And they would have exchanges of goods. So more and more of our modern life really begins here. All right. And finances. Financial practices begin to spring up. Credit springs up, all right? Banking springs up. Eventually, somebody will create double column bookkeeping, which is still the standard today in Italy, all right? So all of these things that we take for granted really start in this period, okay? Even private laws and contract law were created during this period to give protections to both buyer and seller. And in time, the cities become bigger. They're practicing more or less early forms of capitalism, and more tradesmen and more apprentices want to be in the city. Even women sometimes had opportunity. Artemisia, Gentilia Artemisia, I believe her name was. She was one of many female artists who began to get work, in part thanks to her talent and also thanks to her family, who were artists who were able to give her that start. But with the rise in demand for goods, anybody who was competent and had some sort of sponsor, men or women, could enter guilds, could engage in trade, but of course women continued to be the minority in this, all right? And in fact, a lot of serfs who saw the opportunity of the city, some of them ran away to find a way to make money, to become an apprentice to someone in a trade. It was said if you lived in the city for a year and a day and you'd run away as a serf, you became a free person. But of course, try proving you'd been in the city for a year and a day. It was a little sketchy, the laws, but people who could did try to break away, because this is where all the opportunity was in the city. All right. And in fact, a lot of the cities of the Roman Empire, remember we're talking the West, especially in Italy, were broken down and needed repair, but because of their location, they were seen as desirable, and a lot of people were willing to put in the work to rebuild those cities. All right, so this was actually a good thing. But most of those cities were small. We're not talking like Rome at its height during the empire. All right, we're not talking a million people. We're talking a couple hundred, maybe 1,000, maybe several thousand, depending on where you were located. All right, Constantinople really was the last gasp of the Roman Empire, and they were far, far larger than any other city at the time, much like the Roman Empire, the Roman imperial city of Rome itself had been. All right. So just to keep in mind, cities are where the action is, but again, a lot of people are still living on the farm. All right, just keep that in mind. When we speak of cities, we're not talking like New York today. All right, but things begin to change. Knowledge begins to be more sought after. Now, don't get me wrong, all along there were people learning, and there were people who were passionate about, classical learning. Remember, we mentioned some of the texts in chapter 8 that, were missing. People knew things were missing, but they didn't know what they were exactly. And they had references from other works. All right. In a way, your college experience is part of the medieval world. All right. Several universities were established. The first is the University of Bologna, or Unibo as it's called today. It is the most, one of the most active universities, and it has been, if you look at how it's been continually open, the oldest. All right. So the University of Bologna is the oldest university. All right. And it is a knowledge warehouse. People go there to learn. All right. And in fact, you'll enjoy this. Your professors are professors because even in the medieval world, we were lecturing, like I'm lecturing to you now, and we professed to our students. Of course, at the time, all professors and students were male in the medieval world, but professors professed to their students verbally. And I know textbooks can be expensive, but in the medieval world, there were no textbooks. Your professor had everything, and you sat and learned from him, and you wrote everything down because that was the only way you were going to get that knowledge, and all your exams were oral. So you had to communicate mostly verbally. So, and in time, if you, the student, became a professor, you then in turn professed to your students. So, thought you'd enjoy that. So, again, your modern life starts in the Middle Ages, all right? Unfortunately, while universities had positive things to give to society, theologians came out of there. In turn, secretaries, once paper breaks during the Renaissance. So you have physicians, you have lawyers, you have theologians primarily coming out of the university. But the problem was who are your students? Your students are male. Your students are going to be in their teens to early 20s. Nowadays, we know that certain things don't develop in the brain during your teenage years. You're a bit impulsive because your brain is still developing. You don't necessarily have the greatest self-control. All right, and that stabilizes in your early 20s. But of course, nobody knew that back then. But you were expected to act as an adult pretty much from the time you were 8, 9 years old in the Middle Ages because, again, life expectancy, it's getting better, but you're still talking maybe 50, 60 years at most. So you want to get as much value, if you will, out of each person in society, and having them being held to a more adult standard at a younger age was a way to do this. And of course, this goes back to Roman times. 12-year-old boys were expected to be acting more or less like adults. So picture this. You have teenagers, people in their early 20s, and they're all male, and they are all drinking alcohol because the water is not the greatest. So to a greater or lesser degree, they are or are not watering wine and beer. All right. They're also carrying around daggers usually, or pen knives, because they have to sharpen their pens. And they tend to get argumentative when they're drunk, and words are exchanged and fights break out. The so-called town and gown struggles, gown for, if you think of Harry Potter, how they all wore gowns, in Hogwarts, that goes back to the medieval university. All right. So just to put it in perspective, the town and gown struggles, the problems were that you have a bunch of drunk, rowdy teenagers, early 20s, young men. And much like today, college students were writing home for money. They needed money for ink. They needed money for more notebooks. They needed money for fill in the blank. And they stole, in some cases, from the townspeople when they needed things. They got into fights. They broke property. And the town and gown struggles were this uneasy alliance between the town and the university, because the townspeople knew that while the university did help supply business for them, it could also be a detriment. So the town and gown struggles would go on for many, many years. All right. So unfortunately, the university was both a boon and a curse for the townspeople. All right, so just keep that in mind. They drank a lot. All right, our students drank quite a bit, and in fact, medieval records show a high instance of fights and accidents, in part caused by the university students throughout Europe in any university town. All right, and of course, as more and more works come to light. Remember those classical works I mentioned that the Muslim scholars had, and they began to share their knowledge? Well, those things began to trickle into Europe. All right. So good things were happening. It wasn't just about all the drunken fights. All right. And then, of course, let's talk about culture. Remember I mentioned women were idealized? All right. In part because of the literature, in part because of the chivalric or chivalry movement. All right. But women were still seen as subservient to men and subject to male authority. Women were not simply going to be able to do anything they wanted. All right. But when we speak of the culture in the Middle Ages and we speak of chivalry, we have to look at how literature evolved. All right. We start with Beowulf in about the year 800, written down by some Christian monks, and it's now believed that certain pagan practices were smoothed over and Christianized, all right, and that the Anglo-Saxon culture was not necessarily completely faithfully represented. But Beowulf is about a man versus a monster. Lots of action, lots of sword slashing, right? And now literature has evolved and become more nuanced. We have heroic epics, or chansons, which means song in the French. Chansons de geste, basically songs of war. And the Song of Roland is especially critical here. It's a great read. If you ever get a chance to read it, highly recommend. You can get for like $4 or $5 in a Dover edition. A lot of fun. All right. So with that in mind, the Chanson de Geste, Song of Roland, is all about war. It's a mythical account of Charlemagne's nephew, Roland, who never actually existed, fighting off the Muslims and saving the baggage train at the cost of his own life. And it shows him putting his lord, remember military service and vassals, above everything else. In addition, we have troubadour poetry, which talks of courtly love, and we'll visit that in a moment. Of course, we have the romances or Arthurian legends. All right. All of this is encouraged by the church. There was a surplus of young men, all drinking, not just in the university, and these had swords. All right. So your young noblemen who had swords, who were rowdy, the idea was to civilize them somewhat and to keep them from killing each other. So this idea sprung up about what is a knight, what is his obligation to society. All right, so knights were supposed to fight to defend the church. In fact, it was said that the sword hilt, being in the shape of a cross, showed that they were Christian soldiers. All right, they were supposed to protect the weak and defenseless, i.e., women and children. All right, so they were supposed to protect those weaker and defenseless. All right, chivalry serves the church because the church is concerned with saving widows and orphans. So knights were also tasked with saving widows and orphans, and it was said that they were being Christian soldiers, basically, although that term and that song were not written until centuries later. It has its roots here. All of this is to keep society in order. All right, so the idea of courtly love sprang up. If you're familiar with the tales of Arthur, King Arthur, some of this will probably sound very familiar. You have King Arthur and, of course, his bride, Queen Guinevere. But Guinevere and Lancelot, Sir Lancelot, have a courtly love affair. He worships her. She gives him favors for the joust. And that was fine in the vernacular of courtly love. But they crossed a line that never should have been crossed. Courtly love was you worship the object of your affections from afar. You swooned and you pined that she might recognize you and give you a favor for your next joust. You put her on a pedestal. You idealized her. But you never actually consummated the courtly love. You never actually went through physical acts of love. But in Arthurian legend, because Guinevere and Lancelot broke this rule, that was why, it was shown as a cautionary tale in some ways. And of course, it was entertaining. People love to tell these stories. All right. So all of this helps to keep people in check. It helps to keep the knights from killing each other. It helps to keep them basically keeping society going in a peaceful manner. All right. And of course, our new architecture, because remember they had been so busy with with repairing the Roman cities, our architecture becomes Romanesque. I apologize. I'm just checking for the slide here. My apologies. All right. I also want to mention one other thing about society here. All right. Marriage. Marriage was a way to keep society going. So while you could worship and pine for the object of your affection from afar, your marriage served a different purpose. Marriages were, in a way, a business transaction. I know that sounds very cold, but please keep in mind the idea of marrying for love and finding your soulmate and all that really is a modern concept. All right, it really didn't start to come into play until the Victorian era. So a lot of people married for political reasons. It was to further dynastic ambitions. It was to further peace, agreements, to increase wealth. Even merchant families were very cognizant of marrying to increase holdings. All right. So pretty much this is a business transaction. It helps with wealth. It helps with political alliances, all of these things, which of course in turn further the family and further their ambitions, depending on which family you're looking at. All right. And especially in Italy, when trade first breaks out, a lot of these families who are merchants get extremely wealthy, so much so that they're on par with some of the nobility. All right. They really need to protect their holdings. All right. Just some things to consider. So going back to architecture, just to wrap up, yes, we have the Romanesque architecture, because remember they had been finding examples, because they were actually rebuilding these Roman walls and cities. And pretty much any medieval town you went to, you were going to find churches, you were going to find castles and town halls, depending on, if you were going to one of the, more trade-oriented cities. So basically, remember Romanization, how everything began to kind of seem the same, they were importing their culture? Kind of the same thing in the Middle Ages, a lot of the same things. All right. In fact, if you went to a medieval city, you might want to hold your nose, because nobody had access to running water. Nobody had access to modern plumbing. So they literally threw their night soil from their chamber pots out into the streets. And this made it very difficult to walk around, because you're now having to navigate and make sure you look where you walk, because you could be stepping in a puddle of urine, you could be stepping in a pile of manure, and it might not be from the cart horses, although it could be. All right. So the smell was horrific. All right. And of course, waste can bring disease. So medieval cities were not the cleanest. And in fact, tanners, those who tanned hides, because remember, a lot of your most durable products were going to be leather, your belt, maybe a jerkin that you wore over over your top half, like a shirt, almost a sleeveless shirt for protection. All of this had to be crafted, and it was really nasty work. So much so, a lot of cities began to pass ordinances asking tanners to stay outside the city walls when they worked, because it was so bad. All right, so just some things to think about. All right. And of course, again, guilds, those unions. All right. Just to wrap up with the guilds, even today we have unions, which in a sense are like the guilds. They set wages, they set prices, they oversaw the work to make sure it made a particular standard. All right. So it directed almost every aspect of the process from beginning to end, and gave workers protections. All right. So just some things to think about. All right. And of course, here's an example of what a medieval town would look like. You can see the houses are fairly small, 2 stories at most. They're not building towering structures. The biggest buildings in town are going to be the church and the castle for the Lord. All right. So, and of course, again, think of that caruca, that plow, not a dance. All right. And again, the peasant, the agriculture. All right. Imagine doing this day in, day out. It had to be backbreaking. All right. Remember that 3-field system? Okay. Very sumptuous hours. A lot of nobles would pass their time with little books called the Book of Hours. They would have little psalms. They'd have prayers that you would recite at different times of the day. This was a way to help people in the nobility to be reminded of their responsibilities and, what they owed to God and to their communities. As you can see, hunting became popular, falconry became popular with the elite when they weren't at war. All right, the tournament. Gradually, as the church made inroads with chivalry, again from cheval or horse, it's a horse-oriented culture, the tournament was seen as a way to help offset warfare. They began to use single combat in order to fight wars or battles. One person and another person from each side would battle, and they would determine the outcome. We have tournaments of war and tournaments of peace. They could be used to celebrate baptism, namings, somebody getting ascension to their title. So the tournament really begins to replace warfare more. It's a way, again, for the church to channel those warlike energies without having so many people get killed. Although jousting was a really dangerous sport. Henry VIII received a splinter from a lance in his thigh, and after that, he was never the same. Sometimes the wound would get inflamed. I guess they couldn't get the one of the pieces out. It was constantly infected. He was constantly having to take care of it, and that's why he gained so much weight. He used to be a very athletic young man, but after the accident, he began to get heavy and more like the image we think of when we think of Henry VIII today. All right. And even now, if you want to go on metmuseum.org, you can see, if you look in the armor section, you can see horse armor, you can see some other odds and ends, from this period. A lot of the horses would wear boiled leather armor, and then in time, plate armor would be used, but it was so expensive. Most of your armor for horses here is going to be a little bit of steel, a lot of leather, whereas your knights, however, are going to be wearing steel. And of course, certain specialized equipment was used in order to make this more safe for the men, but people did die from just jousting or fighting in tournaments. The melee, you would be on foot, you would use your mace. It could be very dangerous, even with armor on. Just some things to think about. And of course, marriage festivities. Again, marriage is a business transaction. It sounds cold to say it, but people expected this. And in fact, when you got married, you would literally have witnesses waiting outside your bedchamber, waiting for you to consummate the marriage. And then the sheets with the blood of the woman's hymen would be brought out to celebrate the fact that the marriage had taken place. And sometimes women would keep a little vial of chicken blood with them and pour it on the sheet if they might not have a hymen, because of course sometimes women don't. So all of these things were part and parcel for the medieval world's experiences. In fact, divorce was incredibly hard to get. You can only get it if they believed the marriage hadn't been consummated, or if it was on some legal ground it could be annulled. All right, so these are some things that, really were difficult for people. Once you were married, it was for life. So needless to say, a lot of men would cheat on their marriage, even though they weren't supposed to. But of course, women didn't have the same luxury. A lot of men would lose wives in childbirth. Childbirth was incredibly dangerous. So it wasn't uncommon for a 30-year-old man to marry a 14-year-old girl. And of course, being they really weren't fully mature, a lot of these young girls died in childbirth. All right. So it was difficult. It was very difficult. And a lot of marriages, men could marry 2 and 3 times. If a woman managed to survive her marriage and she became widowed, as long as she had borne a male heir and she was of the upper class, most widows elected not to marry again, because they did not want to place themselves in harm's way if they could avoid it with the prospect of childbirth. Of course, their wishes weren't always respected, and their families might get them married again. Okay, as you can see, we have a great trade network springing up across Europe, a lot of different areas of trade. And of course, they're even getting into what used to be Viking territory. All right. Once the Scandinavians became Christianized, they began to join in with some of the trading as well. All right. And as you can see, again, our city landscapes are dominated by the churches and the castle. And this is where all the resources for these societies went. A lot of the money, what there was, were going to beautify and create churches and castles. And of course, you can see there's a wide variety of products. You would probably go to the baker if you were, living in town to get your breakfast, to buy food. There were a lot of different options in towns. All right. And of course, even in Baghdad, in the Islamic world, they had plenty of trade. And in fact, Venice will emerge as the only Christian group who were willing to really trade with the Muslims, and in turn will be bringing in a lot of their goods. And of course, this is another way where those translations from all these, all these classical works from the ancient world begin to come in. In fact, a lot of your Muslim trading people are, wherever possible, starting to translate them into Latin in order to sell them to a wider audience. So they're taking them from the original Greek and Hebrew, or in some cases from the Arabic translations, and they're turning them into Latin translations in order for the West to be able to buy them. It's another method of profit. And of course, as you can see, universities spring up all over. All right, but remember, the University of Bologna is the oldest. And of course, we see a classroom, again, lecturing, just like now, right? Lecturing hasn't changed. So just some things to keep in mind. And of course, notice how the Romanesque church has developed. Now the arch is back. All right, and of course, there wasn't much room for windows because you needed all those walls to support the weight. Later, we're going to see when they discover the flying buttress and understand more of the principles of the dome, we're going to see more of what we think of today with more light getting in. But for now, the Romanesque, not any light getting in really, except for small windows or wall sconces, because they need all that weight to support the walls and to support the arch. All right. And then later it will be replaced with the Gothic, which we'll discuss in more detail. All right. The ribbed vaults, flying buttress, and of course then we will get stained glass windows. So again, here's your timeline. And again, if I'm going too fast, don't worry. You can replay this video, or you can just look at these slides on your own, just the slides without me lecturing, in documents and resources. And of course, you're always welcome to email me, set up an appointment, say, hey, I got some questions. All right. So again, office hours are Tuesday, Thursdays, 3 to 4. Let me know if you need anything. All right. So right now, this is wrapping up chapter 9. We'll be on to chapter 10 very soon. So again, if you need anything, reach out to me, email me, let me know. And in the meantime, I hope you have a great week and enjoy yourselves and try to catch a little sun if you can. All right. Thanks again. It's Professor Olson. Take care.